On the 3rd of July, 1940, the Mediterranean Sea was calm. In the harbor of Mers-el-Kébir on the coast of Algeria, a massive fleet of battleships was at anchor. They were flying the French flag. The sailors were relaxing on the decks, writing letters home or cleaning their equipment. They had just lost the war against Germany, but they thought the fighting was over. They believed they were safe. Then on the horizon, a line of gray steel appeared. It was the British Royal Navy. The French sailors waved. These were their allies. These were the men they had fought alongside just a few weeks ago. They expected a friendly visit, but the British ships did not wave back. They trained their massive 15-inch guns directly at the French hulls. At 5:54 p.m., the order was given. The British opened fire. In 10 minutes of hell, 1,300 French sailors were blown to pieces by their own friends. This was not a mistake. It was a cold, calculated execution ordered by Winston Churchill to prove to the world that Britain would kill anyone, even its own brothers, to survive. We often imagine that alliances are sacred bonds. We think that when two nations fight together in a trench, they become blood brothers forever. But the tragedy of Mers-el-Kébir proves that in the game of empires, there are no brothers. There are only interests. And when survival is at stake, an ally can become an enemy in the blink of an eye. To understand why the British massacred the French Navy, we have to go back to June 1940. The world was falling apart. The German war machine had smashed through the French defenses. The British Army had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving all their tanks and heavy weapons behind. On June 22nd, France surrendered. The French government signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. It was a humiliating moment. Hitler insisted on signing the document in the exact same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. But Winston Churchill, sitting in London, was not focused on the railway carriage. He was focused on the ocean. Britain was now alone. The only thing standing between Hitler and a successful invasion of England was the Royal Navy. If the Germans could control the English Channel for even 24 hours, they could land their panzer divisions on the beaches of Dover. The British Army was too weak to stop them. The math of naval warfare is cruel and simple. It is a numbers game. In 1940, the British Royal Navy was the largest in the world. But the Italian Navy and the German Navy combined were getting dangerously close to matching the British strength. And then there was the French Navy. The French fleet, known as La Royale, was the fourth largest navy in the world. It was modern. It was powerful. It had two brand new battle cruisers, the Dunkirk and the Strasbourg, which were faster and stronger than almost anything the British had. It had the Richelieu, which was one of the most powerful battleships ever built. Churchill looked at the map and he saw a nightmare scenario. Under the terms of the armistice, the French ships were supposed to stay in port and be disarmed. The Germans promised not to use them. Admiral Darlan, the head of the French Navy, promised Churchill that he would never let the Germans take his ships. He swore on his honor that he would scuttle them, sink them before he let a Nazi set foot on the deck. But Churchill was a student of history and a man of deep paranoia. He asked himself a simple question. Is the word of Adolf Hitler worth anything? The answer was obviously no. Hitler had broken every treaty he had ever signed. Churchill believed that it was only a matter of time before the Germans seized the French fleet. Maybe they would threaten to burn Paris. Maybe they would torture the sailors' families. One way or another, Hitler would get those ships. If the German Navy, the Italian Navy, and the French Navy were combined, they would outnumber the British Royal Navy. They would sweep the British from the seas. They would starve the island into submission. And the British Empire would end. So Churchill made the most ruthless decision of his life. He decided that the French fleet had to be eliminated. He called it Operation Catapult. He ordered a British task force, simply called Force H, to sail from Gibraltar to Mers-el-Kébir. Mers-el-Kébir is a port in Algeria, which was then a French colony. The main strength of the French Atlantic Fleet was anchored there. The commander of Force H was Admiral James Somerville. He was a British aristocrat, a naval hero, and a man of honor. When he received the order from London, he was horrified. He was being told to point his guns at men he knew personally. He had dined with the French admirals. They had planned joint operations together. Somerville wrote back to the Admiralty. He said that this was a mistake. He said it would turn the French against them. He said it was ungentlemanly. London wrote back with 3 words, "Carry it out." On the morning of the July 3rd, 1940, the British fleet arrived off the coast of Algeria. It was a formidable force led by the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy. Somerville did not want to open fire immediately. He wanted to give the French a chance. He sent an emissary, Captain Cedric Holland, to deliver a message to the French commander, Admiral Marcel Gensoul. Captain Holland spoke perfect French. He was a friend of Gensoul. He took a small boat into the harbor. The message he carried was an ultimatum. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in military history. It began with expressions of friendship, but it ended with a threat of death. It gave the French 4 options. Option 1, sail your ships out of the harbor and join the British fleet to continue the fight against Germany. Option 2, sail your ships with reduced crews to a British port. We will pay your sailors and return the ships to France at the end of the war. Option 3, sail your ships to the Caribbean or to the United States and demilitarize them there far away from German reach. Option 4, if you refuse these offers, you must sink your ships here and now. And then came the final line. If you refuse to do any of these things, I have the orders of His Majesty's government to use whatever force may be necessary to prevent your ships from falling into German hands. Admiral Ginsel was a proud man. He was a French aristocrat. He was furious. He looked out his porthole and saw the British guns aimed at his ships. He felt betrayed. To him, this was not an offer. It was a gun to his head. He refused to meet Captain Holland personally. He sent his lieutenant to take the message. This was a mistake. It slowed down the communication. Ginsel read the ultimatum, and he focused on the threat. He felt that his honor was being questioned. He had promised that the Germans would never get the ships. Why didn't the British trust him? He signaled back to Somerville saying that the French Navy would answer force with force, but he didn't tell his own government the full truth. He radioed the French naval headquarters, but he only mentioned the ultimatum to sink the ships. He didn't mention the option to sail to the Caribbean. This omission might have sealed the fate of his sailors. All day long, the negotiations dragged on. The sun was beating down. The British ships were patrolling the entrance to the harbor, laying magnetic mines to prevent the French from escaping. The French sailors were at their battle stations, sweating in the steel turrets, waiting for the order to fire. In London, Churchill was pacing the room. He was getting anxious. He knew that the French were calling for reinforcements. French ships and planes from other bases were rushing to Mers-el-Kébir. If Somerville waited too long, the trap would fail. At 5 p.m., Churchill sent a final signal to Somerville. Settle matters quickly, or you will have reinforcements to deal with. Somerville looked at his watch. He looked at the French ships. He could see that they were building up steam. Smoke was pouring from their funnels. They were preparing to make a run for it. He couldn't wait any longer. At 5:54 p.m., Somerville ordered the British fleet to open fire. The HMS Hood unleashed its main battery. 8 massive 15-inch shells roared across the water. The French were sitting ducks. They were anchored in a narrow harbor with their sterns facing the sea. They couldn't bring their main guns to bear. They were trapped against the breakwater. The first British salvo hit the battleship Betrayal. The shell penetrated the magazine where the ammunition was stored. The ship exploded in a massive fireball. It capsized in minutes, taking nearly 1,000 sailors down with it. The Dunkirk was hit. The Provence was hit. The destroyer Mogador was blown apart. The harbor turned into an inferno. Oil was burning on the water. Men were screaming. The sound of the explosions echoed off the cliffs. The French tried to return fire, but they were blinded by the smoke and the position of their ships. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The shooting lasted only 10 minutes. Somerville signaled to cease fire. He couldn't bear to watch anymore. He turned his fleet around and sailed back to Gibraltar. Behind him, the pride of the French Navy was burning. 1,300 French sailors were dead. The reaction in France was explosive. The French people were outraged. The Germans used it as propaganda, saying, "Look, we told you the British are the real enemy. We are treating you better than your old allies." For a few days it looked like France might declare war on Britain. French planes actually launched a retaliatory bombing raid on Gibraltar. General Charles de Gaulle, who was in London trying to organize the Free French resistance, was devastated. He thought his movement was dead. How could he ask Frenchmen to join the British when the British had just murdered their comrades? But in the United States, the reaction was very different. President Franklin Roosevelt had been watching Britain closely. He was worried that Britain was going to surrender. His advisors told him that Churchill was just a talker and that the British would cut a deal with Hitler. But when news of Mers-el-Kébir reached the White House, Roosevelt realized he was wrong. He realized that a nation that was willing to kill its own friends to save itself was a nation that would never surrender. It was a grim, bloody proof of resolve. Mers-el-Kébir convinced the Americans that Britain was worth supporting. It opened the door for Lend-Lease and eventually for American entry into the war. So in a cold, strategic sense, Churchill was right. The attack secured the political survival of Britain. But morally, it remains a deep scar. Was it necessary? Admiral Darlan had promised the ships would never be taken, and history proved him right. 2 years later, in November 1942, the Germans finally broke the armistice and invaded the rest of France. They marched into the naval base at Toulon to seize the remaining French fleet. The French admirals were true to their word. As the German tanks crashed through the gates of the dockyard, the French officers gave the order. They scuttled the fleet. 77 ships were sunk by their own crews to keep them out of Nazi hands. They did exactly what they said they would do. This makes the tragedy of Mers-el-Kébir even more bitter. The 1,300 men who died in 1940 died for nothing. They died because Churchill couldn't afford to trust a promise. The relationship between the Royal Navy and the French Navy never fully recovered. Even today there's a tension. The French Navy is never forgotten. For the British sailors who took part in the attack, it was the worst day of their lives. Many of them wept at their stations. They knew they were committing a crime against brotherhood. Admiral Somerville famously said afterwards that it was the biggest political blunder of modern times and will rouse the whole world against us. He was wrong about the world, but he was right about the shame. But Churchill never apologized. In his memoirs, he called it a hateful decision and the most unnatural and painful in which I have ever been concerned. But he also said it was necessary for the life of the state. This is the terrible logic of total war. It strips away civilization. It reduces everything to the binary of life and death. The lesson of Operation Catapult is a frightening one. It teaches us that in the international arena there is no such thing as absolute trust. A sovereign nation will always prioritize its own survival above everything else, above friendship, above honor, above the lives of its allies. The French sailors at Mers-el-Kébir were not casualties of war in the traditional sense. They were casualties of fear. They were casualties of a calculation made on a piece of paper in a cabinet room in London. They were the collateral damage of an empire fighting for its life. The story of the French execution challenges the romantic view of World War II. We like to see the Allies as a band of brothers. We like to see the moral lines clearly drawn. But on that hot July afternoon in Algeria, the lines were blurred. The good guys were shooting the good guys. The heroes were slaughtering the heroes. It reminds us that the path to victory was paved not just with the blood of enemies, but with the blood of friends. Churchill is often quoted as saying, "We shall never surrender." Mers-el-Kébir showed the world exactly what that meant. It meant that Britain would do anything, absolutely anything, to stay free, even if it meant becoming a monster for 10 minutes. The wrecks of the French battleships lay in the harbor for years. They were silent monuments to the ruthlessness of power. Today, the harbor is quiet. But if you talk to the old families in Brittany and Normandy, they still remember the names of the brothers and fathers who died that day. They remember that the shells that killed them were not German. They were British. And they remember that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the enemy facing you, but the ally standing behind you. We often say that war is hell, but we usually mean the fighting. The real hell of war is the choices it forces you to make. The choice between honor and survival. The choice between betrayal and extinction. In 1940, Churchill chose survival, and the ghosts of Mers-el-Kébir are the price he paid.